Hi, I'd like to give you some feedback on your mind map. So your central idea for accessing the subcutaneous port, right, that is as a teaching area is a good one. So the central idea is fine. So let's take a look at your theories. So you've selected broad theories: humanism, behaviorism, constructivism, and cognitism. So I want you to look here at cognitivism, right? So for here you've got different theorists. So this is good, right? You've got Gangmi, you've got Piaget, right? So, and you've got their sub-theories, right? So, or their own particular theories from this broad category. So for constructivism, you did a good job. When you go up to humanism, however, look here. So you just have one theorist, right? You have Rogers. So Rogers is, right, a humanistic theorist, but there are other humanistic theorists, like someone I'm sure you've heard of, like Maslow, right? And maybe someone that you haven't heard of before, and that's Bugental, Bugental. So these are also humanistic theorists, right? So remember, if you pick a broad theory, you need more than just one theorist listed. Okay? So when I go over here, again, I'm just looking at these components for behaviorism. I see Thorndike and Skinner, and that's absolutely correct, right? Those are definitely behaviorists. There's also Watson, and a big one that you may have heard of in psychology, Pavlov and his dogs, right? They were also behavioralists, right, when you look at those educational theories. And then we come down to constructivism, and you've done a nice job here. You've given me Bruner. Bruner's definitely a constructivist. Actually, Bandura lives between constructivism and behavioralism, so he's kind of, his theory kind of crosses those two. So I want to make sure that you understand that Bandura does span both constructivism and behavioralism. Right? He brings both of those into play. Right? And you have Volsky, which is, I can never say his name right, Lev, and he is definitely one of the constructivist theorists. And there's also Piaget is a constructivist theorist. A pure constructivist, right? So watch for some of our theorists, as some of these theorists make combined theories, right? And that's how they make their own individual theory. Right? So when you go up, and let's look at the general theories, and we'll just go down each one of them. So for humanism, the view of knowledge for humanism, I say it's student-driven, kind of like on your own time, right? And it does have to deal with self-actualization, right? That's where Maslow's theory kind of fits into that humanistic lens, right? So if the view of learning is that the learning process comes from the students, right? That's where the view of learning is, that the learning process, right, has to do with students wanting to achieve, right, their own value in their educational process, right, in their educational journey. The role of the student is that they're definitely in charge, right, of their own learning, right. The role of the educator is to create that learning environment, right, so that those students within that learning environment can create meaning, for themselves, right, and then how to use it, right. Here, with speaking, instruct the students to speak to the patient and explaining the steps of the procedure. I'm wondering how that fits into humanism very clearly, right? So I need a little bit more explanation if you're going to use humanism. Explain why this would be part of the learner experience, right? So not part of the teaching the patient experience, but how is that part of the learner experience? More so than it being patient-centered. And so how does that making that learner-centered? Right? and having students perform their own self-evaluations to kind of figure out, what they're doing, that's very, very valid. Cognitism. When I think of cognitism, I think of computers. I think of process. So cognitism thinks of the processes surrounding learning, right? So how do we do this input-output, right, type of processing that builds one on the other? Knowledge is actively acquired. You have knowledge, a view of knowledge, that it's acquired through mental processes. That's very good, right? So again, it's very process-based, right? Our view of learning, right, is that learning occurs in process, right? And it needs to follow a certain steps in the process for learning to occur, right? Students have to be active, that's true, but what else in cognitism happens? What else are students responsible for? Not only becoming active participants, but learning that processing, right? Being involved in the process. Not just actively involved, but processing in a way, being active in a way that follows that process, right? So as educators, right, we need to design not only opportunities so that they can elicit the information, right, and making bridges, right, for gaps, but we need to be very focused on the process of things, right? So if we're talking about computers and computer-like learning, we're talking about processing and making sure that those processes are evident in our educational environment that we create as an educator, right? So you want to provide, I think it's a good idea here, what you're saying, provide an overview of patient access types, right? And then different types of ports, but also design those logical step-by-step instructions for cognitivist learners, right? For a cognitive this theory to occur. So in cognitism, you want to be focused on processing, right? And processing that information and processing it in a certain way. Again, very computeristic. Behavioralism, what I think of that is it's a reactionary type of theory. So learning is passively done. Learning is in reaction to a stimulus, right? So behavior is learned, right? What you're saying for knowledge is behavior is learned and can be shaped and rewarded to receive desired outcomes. Behavior is learned, right? Using those rewards and punishments too, right? And I think that's where we lose sight of it. The reward part, students like if they're being rewarded, but put it in quotes, the punishment part, in other words, taking points off or, giving out bad grades or constructive feedback that may not be the feedback that the student wants, right? The gift of feedback. Feedback is always a gift, but sometimes you want to return it because it's not exactly what you wanted as a learner based on the effort that you put in. I think that's where the disconnect is when we think of behaviorism and that positive and that reinforcement, right, of behavior. We can reinforce behavior positively or we can reinforce it negatively. What we may see as a positive reinforcement, like feedback, students may see it as a negative. So you just need to be careful there when you're thinking about behaviorism and using some of these techniques, right? So I agree with your view of knowledge, your view of learning, demonstrated by change in behavior, right? Learning is active, of course. And student motivation is toward that reward, right? That desired behavior, again, very grade-based, right? Very outcome-based, and sometimes takes away from learning, I find. So just be careful when you're thinking about behaviorism. Yes, you can create experiences and environments, but if it's all based on reward versus, we'll say, versus punishment versus no reward, students may choose the way that's going to get them the reward, but not necessarily get them the learning, right? So it's kind of like with good test takers, right? So you just got to kind of watch out for that. And then we go down to constructivism. And constructivism, I see as the build, right? I see that as like building a house, right? building a house with a solid foundation and then building on that, or like building Legos. We have one Lego and then the other Lego and kind of builds on each other to make a bigger thing, right? That's constructivism in my mind. So knowledge is built, right, on an attempt to understand experiences and gain meaning from prior knowledge, right? So from prior knowledge, right, is that really good piece that you have in there. So yes, it's to build and understand experiences, but it's all based on prior knowledge, right? Learning is interactive, right? Because we need to have that student, right, actually explicate to us what their prior learning is, right? So that's kind of that pre-conference or pre-test thing that we'll do in a classroom to say, what do you know? Right? And you are definitely a facilitator in constructivism as an educator, because you need to understand where your students are coming from, what they've brought to the table, and then help them build on that, right? And oftentimes you're building different builds with different people. So think about it as, you're building Legos with maybe a group of 10 children, and a couple are building houses, and somebody's building a plane, and then somebody over here on the left is building a tree. But they all need to get to this thing, right, this broader thing, which is this picture that you told them to make with the Legos, right? So they're all coming at it with different perspectives to get to that same outcome, and that is a pictorial description built with Legos. So think of it like that. You could think of it like that, right? So how this theory informs the instruction, right? Demonstrate the modeling of the skill, absolutely. Having them try to build on that, practicing their own. Debriefing is a really, really good piece to put in here, but I want you to also think about maybe something before that activity. How are you going to know what your students know for real, what they've learned for real, before they come into the experience, right, of accessing a port? Do they even know what a port is? Maybe they don't, right? Do they even know how the needles look different and why it's important that they're different? They may not, right? So think about that. So overall, your mind map, I think, is good. There are a couple things you need to work on for your paper. Think about really clearly picking a theorist, not just a broad theory, but a theorist in their specific theory. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.